Today, we will embark on a journey that will overturn the perception of the most famous discoverer in human history. His name is known to everyone, Christopher Columbus. But what do we truly know about him? Who was he? A hero or a villain? A saint or a sinner? A savior or a destroyer? This is not just a story about the discovery of a new continent. It is a story about a man who believed in the impossible but paid a terrible price for it. About a man whose name became a symbol, a legend, a myth, and a curse at the same time. Imagine a map of the world. On it are two vast continents, North and South America, cities bearing his name, squares, monuments, ships, universities, an entire country, Colombia, and even the capital of the United States once unofficially bore a name in his honor. Christopher Columbus. Pronounce this name, and an image appears before your eyes. A majestic navigator in a wide-brimmed hat, his gaze fixed far away, beyond the horizon, to where the sea meets the sky. School textbooks paint him as a hero, a man who dared to challenge the ocean and opened the new world to Europe. But if you ask the residents of Latin America about this man, you will hear something completely different. For many indigenous peoples, Columbus is not a hero, but a symbol of tragedy, the beginning of a 400-year nightmare. In the 20th and 21st centuries, his monuments began to be torn down across America. In Richmond, the statue was drowned in a lake. In Boston, it was decapitated. In Baltimore, it was pulled down from its pedestal with ropes. Columbus Day, once celebrated with pride, has now been renamed Indigenous Peoples Day in many American states. Protesters call him the face of genocide and demand the removal of his images from public spaces. How did this happen? How can the same man be simultaneously a great discoverer and a monster? Is it even possible to be a savior to some and an executioner to others? This story is about two sides of the same coin, about how the dream of discovering the world turned into a tragedy for entire peoples, about how one man, driven by faith and ambition, changed the course of history, but at what cost? To understand why Christopher Columbus decided upon what seemed madness to many, one must momentarily return to the end of the 15th century. Imagine Europe just beginning to awaken after long centuries of the Middle Ages. This was a time when the old world was dying and the new one had not yet been born. On the 29th of May, 1453rd year, an event occurred that shook the entire Christian world to its foundation. Constantinople, the great capital of the Byzantine Empire, the heir of ancient Rome, a city that had stood for more than 1,000 years, fell under the onslaught of Ottoman troops. Sultan Mehmed II, whom historians would later call the Conqueror, entered the city as a victor. This fall redrew the entire map of the world. For centuries, European merchants brought from the East things without which the lives of the nobility seemed bland and poor: spices, silk, jewels, incense, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, pepper. All this was not merely seasoning for food, it was a symbol of status, a method of preserving food, a medicine for all ailments. The spice trade brought fabulous profits. Merchants amassed entire fortunes. The main trade route went through the Mediterranean Sea, through Constantinople, and further along land caravan routes through Persia, India, and China. Now, this path fell under Ottoman control. They established exorbitant duties, dictated terms, and made trade almost unprofitable. Europe was suffocating within its own borders. It had become cramped. Portugal was the first to start searching for a way out. Portuguese navigators gradually advanced along the western coast of Africa, hoping to circumnavigate the continent and find a sea route to India, bypassing the Ottoman lands. But this was a long, agonizing path, full of dangers and uncertainty. At this time, a completely insane idea lingered in the air. What if they tried to reach India not from the east, but from the west? Simply sail across the Atlantic Ocean, and one would find oneself on the other side of the globe, in the land of spices and gold. After all, the earth is round. Educated people of that time already understood this. Ancient scientists calculated the size of the planet with astonishing accuracy 1,500 years before this. The Greek mathematician Eratosthenes determined the diameter of the Earth, erring by only 1%. But in the 15th century, this knowledge was partially forgotten, mixed with Christian notions of the world. Medieval Christian geography was a fanciful mixture of ancient science and biblical texts. Maps of that time often placed Jerusalem in the center of the world. It was believed that somewhere on the edge of the world lay the terrestrial paradise from which Adam and Eve were expelled. They believed that monsters inhabited the oceans, and on unexplored islands lived people with heads of dogs or with one enormous foot. Scholar monks who found refuge in the monasteries of Christian Europe were not observers or experimenters. Their efforts focused on extracting information from ancient documents and attempting to reconcile geographical concepts with the book of Genesis. The main task was somehow to reconcile science and faith. And so, in Florence, a city of arts, commerce, and free thought, lived a scholar named Paolo dal Pozzo Toscanelli, an astronomer, mathematician, geographer, physician, a true Renaissance man. He translated the works of the ancient scholar Ptolemy into Latin, studied ancient maps, and collected information about distant lands from travelers and merchants. Toscanelli was convinced that the western route to India was possible. He created a map on which he plotted the distance across the Atlantic to the shores of Asia. However, he made a fatal error in his calculations. Toscanelli nearly doubled the length of the Asian continent while simultaneously reducing the size of the Earth itself. The result was that the distance from Europe to India via the Western Ocean seemed quite short, only a few weeks of sailing. In the year 1474, Toscanelli wrote a letter to the Portuguese king attaching his map. He proposed organizing an expedition to the west, but the Portuguese refused. They were already investing enormous effort and money into the African route and did not want to take the risk. Meanwhile, somewhere in Portugal lived an unknown Genoese sailor, Christopher Columbus, the son of a weaver, a man without noble lineage, without wealth, without connections, but with burning eyes and an iron belief in his mission. No one knows exactly how Toscanelli's letter and map came into Columbus's hands. Perhaps through mutual Florentine acquaintances living in Lisbon. Perhaps he himself sought out the scholar and wrote to him. Regardless, Columbus obtained a copy of the map and the letter, and they changed his entire life. Columbus was a man of his time, the Renaissance era, when everything seemed possible. When art flourished with unprecedented colors, science took its first tentative steps, and the boundaries of the world expanded year by year. It was the age of titans, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Botticelli, a time when man felt himself to be the center of the universe, when individuality came to be valued above tradition. Yet, Columbus remained a deeply religious, almost mystical man. He believed that God had chosen him specifically for a great mission, that this was not merely a voyage for gold and spices, but a sacred task, to expand the boundaries of the Christian world and convert millions of pagans to the true faith. He studied everything he could find about the geography of the world. He read the works of ancient authors, travelers' notes, and descriptions of distant lands. He was especially inspired by the tales of the Venetian merchant Marco Polo about the fabulous riches of the East, about gold, precious stones, the palaces of the Chinese emperor, and islands with pearl shores. Columbus dreamed of seeing all of this with his own eyes. He was a self-taught mathematician, a navigator, a sailor, but above all, he was a fanatic of his idea, a fanatic of faith, a fanatic of his dream. He believed that the discovery of the western route to India would not just be a commercial venture, it would be a step toward converting the whole world to Christianity, toward liberating the Holy Land from Muslims, toward the dawn of a new era for humanity. This faith, this obsession, gave him strength, because ahead lay years of humiliation, refusals, and mockery. Years when the whole world told him no. Yet, he continued to stand his ground. He continued to believe. Christopher Columbus was born somewhere between the end of August and the end of October, in the year 1451 in Genoa, a maritime republic in northwestern Italy, a city of merchants, sailors, and adventurers. No one knows his exact date of birth, nor, for that matter, many other details of his early childhood. 6 Italian and Spanish cities still dispute exactly where he came into the world. He was a man without a specific address of birth, without documents that would confirm his origins, as if fate prepared him from the beginning to become a man of the world, belonging to no single land. His father was named Domenico Colombo. He was a weaver, a master craftsman of moderate means, earning a living through honest labor. Not a pauper, but not a rich man either. A person who knew the value of every coin, yet strove to give his children what he himself lacked. His mother, Susanna Fontanarosa, the daughter of a weaver, managed the home and raised 5 children. Christopher had 3 brothers, Giovanni, Bartolomeo, and Giacomo, and a sister, Bianchella. Giovanni died as a child, taking a part of the family warmth with him. Bianchella grew up, married, and lived a quiet, measured life. And Bartolomeo and Giacomo would later become Christopher's faithful companions in his insane wanderings across the ocean. A strange mystery shrouds Columbus's early years. This boy from a simple weaver's family somehow received an astonishingly good education, the kind that in the 15th century was only available to the children of the nobility or very wealthy merchants. Until the age of 14, Christopher was educated at home: mathematics, Latin, several modern languages, the basics of astronomy and navigation, and geography. Who were his teachers? Where did a weaver's family get the money for such an education? Some researchers believe that the Columbus family actually had Jewish roots. They were Marranos, baptized Jews concealing their origin in an era when Spain and Italy viewed Jews with suspicion. Perhaps this explains their desire to give their children a broad education. In the Jewish tradition, knowledge was always valued above wealth. Perhaps this is why Columbus carefully concealed the details of his origin throughout his life, changing names, confusing his tracks. Later, in his youth, Christopher entered the University of Padua, one of the centers of European learning at the time. There, he met the astronomer and geographer Paolo Toscanelli, the very man whose map and idea of a western route to India would forever change his destiny. They discussed the shape of the Earth, the distances to Asia, and the possibility of crossing the ocean. Toscanelli saw a vibrant mind and an insatiable thirst for knowledge in the young student. The sea beckoned Christopher from his early youth. In Genoa, a city that lives by the sea, breathes the sea, builds ships, and equips expeditions, it was impossible to grow up without feeling this call. At the age of 14 or 15, he first went to sea as a cabin boy on a Genoese merchant vessel. He sailed the Mediterranean Sea, from port to port, from island to island. There, on the decks of the rocking galleys, listening to the stories of merchants and sailors about the untold riches of the East, gold, spices, silks, precious stones the size of a hen's egg, palaces of the Chinese emperor covered in gold, Columbus first seriously considered, what if he found a direct route to these treasures? A route that would bypass all intermediaries, all Arab merchants, all Ottomans with their duties. In the 70s of the 15th century, Christopher sailed extensively to the shores of North Africa, east to the Greek island of Chios, where the Genoese traded with the East. Until the year 1472, he lived in Genoa, helping his father with the weaving business, but the sea did not let go. Then he moved to Savona, another Ligurian port, and in the middle of the 70s, fate led him to Portugal. Genoa, after the fall of Constantinople in the year 1453, lost huge eastern markets. The Ottomans blocked traditional trade routes. Genoese merchants went bankrupt, and many scattered across Europe looking for work and fortune. Columbus found himself among these economic refugees. Lisbon in those years was the heart of the Portuguese maritime empire. Prince Henry the Navigator established a genuine school of navigation in Portugal. Expeditions were sent from there along the African coast, with the Portuguese advancing further south year after year, dreaming of circumnavigating Africa and finding a sea route to India. Columbus was initially, in modern terms, a migrant worker, a stranger in a strange land, looking for any job. But gradually, he settled in, adapted, and found his place. He served on Portuguese ships, compiled nautical charts, a prestigious and well-paid occupation during the era of great discoveries. In Portugal, Columbus married, and this was a marriage that changed his status. Doña Filipa Moniz de Perestrelo was the daughter of the governor of Porto Santo Island, a woman of noble, albeit impoverished, lineage. For a poor Genoese sailor, a foreigner without title or wealth, this was an incredibly advantageous marriage. He gained access to Portuguese society, to the maps and documents of his deceased father-in-law, and to court connections. Their son Diego was born, a firstborn whom Columbus deeply loved. But their marital happiness did not last long. Filipa died young, leaving Christopher with a small child in his arms. Some biographers believe she died in childbirth. Others suggest the cause was plague or another illness. It is not known exactly. It is only known that the loss of his wife deeply affected Columbus, making him more withdrawn, more obsessed with his idea. Under the Portuguese flag, Columbus sailed far. To the coasts of England and Ireland, perhaps even Iceland. There he might have heard Icelandic sagas about Vinland, a land in the west that the Norsemen had discovered 500 years before him. He sailed to Madeira and the Canary Islands, reaching the shores of modern Ghana along the west coast of Africa. Everywhere, he gazed intently at the sea, studying winds and currents, keeping records, accumulating knowledge. It was in Portugal that the idea of a western route to India finally consumed his mind. He read everything he could find: Marco Polo's book about the journey to China, the works of ancient geographers, Toscanelli's letters. He performed calculations, compiled maps, and computed distances. And he became increasingly convinced the journey was possible, the distance was not as great as others believed, and the risk was justified. Around the years 1475 to 80th, Columbus first attempted to find support for his project. First, he approached the government and merchants of his native Genoa. No response followed. The Genoese considered the idea insane. Then, in the year 1483 or 84th, Columbus mustered the courage and approached the Portuguese King João II. The king was an educated man, interested in geography and navigation. He listened carefully to Columbus. He then assembled a commission, the best scientists, navigators, cosmographers, and monk astronomers. They meticulously studied the Genoese man's calculations, checked his maps, and asked questions. And they refused. They said that Columbus was mistaken about the size of the Earth, that he underestimated the distance to Asia, that the ships would not be able to travel such a distance without stops to replenish water and food supplies, that his plan was pure madness, and the king should not spend money on this venture. Columbus was deeply disappointed, but not broken. Portugal was not the only maritime power in Europe. He tried to appeal to the English king through his brother Bartolomé, also a refusal. He sent a letter to the King of France. Silence. By this time, Columbus's life in Portugal had become unbearable. His wife had died, leaving him with a small son. Debts had accumulated. Portuguese creditors were not known for their patience. The project to which he had dedicated years was rejected by everyone. In his early 30s, Christopher Columbus was a penniless widower, with a child to care for, and an insane dream that no one believed in. The 1485th year, fleeing from debts and disgrace, Columbus and his son Diego secretly moved to Spain. He relocated not as an honored guest, but almost as a fugitive. He had no money, no connections, not even a clear plan. He only had hope. During the winter of the 1485th to 86th years, Columbus and his son found refuge in the Franciscan monastery of Santa Maria de la Rábida, near the small port of Palos. The prior, Father Juan Pérez de Marchena, was an educated and kind man. He listened to the strange Genoese with burning eyes who spoke of a western route to India, of gold, and of the salvation of millions of souls. And he believed, or at least decided to help. Father Juan wrote a letter to Queen Isabella's confessor with a brief summary of Columbus's ideas. This letter became the first step in a long campaign. Columbus managed to interest the Duke of Medinaceli in his project, a wealthy aristocrat who owned a large fleet. The Duke was ready to finance the expedition with his own funds. But then he considered, what if Columbus actually found a new route to India? Such a discovery was too important for a private individual. This was a matter for kings. And the Duke introduced Columbus to the royal financial advisors, merchants, bankers, and to his uncle, the powerful Cardinal Mendoza. In the winter of the 1486th year, Columbus was presented to Pedro González de Mendoza, Archbishop of Toledo and Great Cardinal of Spain, one of the most influential men in the country. He, in turn, arranged an audience for him with the Catholic monarchs of Spain, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. This was a meeting that would change the history of the world. On the 20th of January in the 1486th year, in Córdoba, Columbus appeared before the royal couple for the first time. Isabella was 35 years old. She was an intelligent, authoritative, and deeply religious woman. Ferdinand, her husband, was a calculating politician, more interested in tangible benefits than in dreams. Columbus laid out his plan. He spoke confidently, passionately, convincingly. About the western route to India that would allow Spain to bypass Portuguese competitors and gain direct access to the riches of the East. About the gold of the Great Khan, about spices, about precious stones, about silks and pearls, about the millions of pagan souls that could be converted to Christianity and saved from eternal perdition, about how all the glory and all the riches would fall to the Spanish crown, and that Spain would become the greatest power in the world. Isabella listened carefully. She was interested not so much in the commercial side of the project as in the religious one. Spain had just completed the Reconquista, a 7-century struggle for the expulsion of the Moors from the Iberian Peninsula. Isabella saw herself as a defender of the faith, a warrior of Christ. The idea of converting millions of souls in the East, accumulating wealth, and someday reclaiming Jerusalem from the Muslims, this idea deeply touched her heart. But the decision was not made immediately. A special commission was appointed to study Columbus's proposals. It included theologians, cosmographers, jurists, monks, and courtiers, everyone who understood at least something about geography, navigation, or international law. The commission met for 4 years, 4 agonizing years of waiting. Columbus lived somewhere between hope and despair. The Queen granted him a small allowance, enough for a modest life, but nothing more. He followed the royal court from city to city, Córdoba, Seville, Murcia, Granada. He bowed to courtiers, tried to find new patrons, waited. In Córdoba, Columbus met a young peasant woman named Beatriz Enriquez de Arana. They began living together, although they never officially married. In the 1488th year, Beatriz bore him a second son, Fernando. Columbus loved her in his own way, but his main passion remained the dream of the voyage. Spain was at war. The last Muslim stronghold on the Iberian Peninsula, the Emirate of Granada, was stubbornly resisting. The war required enormous resources. The royal treasury had no money for the dubious ventures of the Genoese. Columbus was encouraged, decisions were postponed, and they promised to consider it after the war ended, but no concrete promises were given. These years were arguably the hardest in Columbus's life. He felt time slipping away. He was already over 35, then over 40. By the standards of the 15th century, almost an old man. Fevers and disappointments undermined his health, but he did not give up, clinging to his dream like a drowning man to a straw. On the 2nd of January, in the 1492nd year, Granada fell. The last king of the Moors, Boabdil, surrendered the keys to the city to the Catholic monarchs. The Reconquista, a centuries-long struggle, was complete. All of Spain rejoiced. Columbus hoped that now, finally, the king and queen could dedicate attention to his project. But again there was a commission, again a review, again endless delays, and then a refusal, a final categorical refusal. The commission deemed Columbus's plan unfeasible, but most importantly, King Ferdinand was outraged by Columbus's demands. The Genoese wanted too much. The title of Admiral of the Ocean Sea, lifelong and hereditary. The position of Viceroy and Governor of all lands he would discover. A 10th share of all income, all wealth, and all trade with the new territories. The right to appoint officials, judges, and ship captains. For a poor foreigner without title or wealth, for a simple sailor, this was incredible audacity. Even if he did discover something, why should he be given such power and such money? Ferdinand categorically refused. Columbus was crushed. 10 years, a full 10 years, he had fought, trying to realize his dream. Portugal, England, France, Spain, refusals everywhere. 10 years of humiliation, mockery, and poverty. 10 years when he was considered a madman. Enough. He could not take any more. Columbus decided to try his luck one last time. He would go to France. Perhaps the French King Charles VIII would be more far-sighted. In January of the 1492nd year, Columbus left the court and set out on his journey. Along the way, he stopped to say goodbye at the La Rábida monastery, where he had once found refuge with his small son. His old friend, Father Juan Perez, Queen Isabella's former confessor, was there. He listened to the despairing Columbus, and he wrote a letter to the Queen. an emotional, sincere letter. He reminded Isabella of her duty to God and of the possibility of saving millions of souls. He wrote that Spain was losing a chance that would not be repeated. He warned that other kings would take advantage of this man, and then Spain would regret it. Father Juan believed that Columbus was not crazy, but a prophet. Isabella received the letter and pondered it. She always trusted Father Juan. Furthermore, her treasurer, Luis de Santangel, also took up the task of persuading the Queen. He spoke from a position of sober calculation. The risk was small. If Columbus failed, Spain would lose 3 ships and a small sum of money. But if he succeeded, the gain would be enormous. And if Columbus left and succeeded with the help of another king, it would be a disgrace from which Spain would not recover. Isabella hesitated, consulted with Ferdinand, and prayed, and she made a decision. She sent a messenger to Columbus with money for the journey and an invitation to return immediately. Columbus was already several kilometers from the border with France when the messenger overtook him. He turned around and galloped back. His heart was beating so hard that it seemed it would burst from his chest. Perhaps, finally, after 10 years of hardship, his dream would come true. On the 17th of April, in the 1492nd year, a treaty was signed in the military camp in the town of Santa Fe, at the very location from which the Spanish had stormed Granada. The document of 8 points, which historians would call the Capitulations of Santa Fe. The terms were those that Columbus had scarcely dared to dream of. Christopher Columbus received the title of Admiral of all seas and oceans he would discover, for life, and this title was to pass to his heirs forever. He became Viceroy and Chief Governor of all lands discovered by him, also for life, and with the right to hereditary transmission of the title. He was entitled to 1/10, a whole 1/10, of all income from trade with the new territories. He received the right to appoint officials to all posts in the colonies, the right to judge and pardon, and the right to participate as an investor in any trade expeditions. This was a dizzying success, an incredible, unthinkable success for a man without title, without wealth, without connections, a foreigner, the son of a weaver. The crown, however, retained supreme power over all new lands, the right to declare war and conclude peace, and the right to issue laws. But these reservations seemed unimportant to Columbus. He had gained what he had strived for 10 years. But the main thing was not the titles or the money. The main thing was that he finally received the opportunity to realize his dream, to prove everyone who did not believe him, who laughed, who called him a madman, that he was right, to open a new route to India, to bring glory to Spain and salvation to millions of souls. Columbus believed. He believed with his entire being, every fiber of his soul, every drop of blood. He believed that God had chosen him specifically for this sacred mission, that everything that happened to him, the refusals, humiliations, years of waiting, was a trial of faith. And he had passed that trial. In his letters, in his records, in the diaries he would keep during the voyage, Columbus repeated again and again, "The Lord chose me to discover a new world." This was not just a phrase. This was his deepest conviction, the essence of his personality. He felt himself to be not merely a captain setting out on a trade expedition. He felt himself to be an instrument of God's will, a messenger, a prophet, an elect one, a mystic and a dreamer, a fanatic of faith, and an ambitious man yearning for glory, a self-taught mathematician and a brilliant navigator, cruel in his ambitions, yet sincere in his piety. All this strangely coexisted in one man. In a man of the Renaissance era, an era when individuality blossomed in all its contradictory beauty. Now, only one thing remained: to set out on the journey, a journey that would change the history of humanity forever, a journey from which there would be no return, neither for him nor for the world. The early morning of the 2nd of August, in the 1492nd year, in the small Spanish port of Palos de la Frontera, the narrow cobbled streets were filled with people. Women were weeping, pressing handkerchiefs to their chests. Children clung to their fathers' clothes. Old people crossed themselves and whispered prayers, looking at the 3 ships swaying in the harbor. In the air hung a mixture of smells: salt water, freshly baked bread from the port bakeries, cheap wine with which the sailors drowned their fear of the unknown. The Santa Maria, the Pinta, and the Niña, not the newest ships, not the fastest, not the most reliable. The Santa Maria, the flagship, was a heavy and unwieldy carrack, loaded with cannons and supplies. The Pinta and the Niña were light, fast caravels, designed for maneuvering along the shores, but not for crossing the endless ocean. These were the only ships they agreed to give for the Genoese man's mad enterprise. The crew, about 90 people, was a motley crowd gathered from all corners of Spain. Here were former convicts who had been promised a pardon for participating in the expedition, people who had nothing to lose but life, which they considered lost anyway. Ruined merchants seeking quick enrichment in the golden lands of the East about which Columbus spoke. Young dreamers from poor families who believed the Admiral's tales of untold treasures and great glory. Experienced sailors from Palos and neighboring ports, hired for good money by the Pinzon brothers, local captains who agreed to accompany Columbus. Martin Alonso Pinzon, an experienced navigator, a decisive and ambitious man who saw a chance to get rich in this journey, became the captain of the Pinta. His younger brother, Vicente Yáñez Pinzon, more calm and easygoing, commanded the Niña. The flagship Santa Maria was led by its owner, Juan de la Cosa, an experienced cartographer and sailor, and the overall command of the expedition was carried out by Christopher Columbus, Admiral of the ocean sea, Viceroy of the lands he was only about to discover. On the 2nd of August, the ships were towed by oars outside the outer bar and anchored. Columbus did not want to sail on this day. Something inside told him to wait one more day. Perhaps he prayed, preparing his soul for the great trial. Perhaps he simply gave the crew one last night on solid ground. At dawn on the 3rd of August, in the 1492nd year, all 3 caravels raised their sails. The great voyage began, quietly, routinely, to the cries of gulls and the splash of oars. The ships set a course southwest toward the Canary Islands. The distance was about 1,600 kilometers, a familiar, not frightening, route. The first days passed calmly. The sea was calm, the wind favorable, and the crew's spirits were high. The sailors joked, sang songs, played dice, and shared dreams of gold and glory. Columbus stood on the deck of the Santa Maria and looked out at the horizon, to where the sky merged with the sea, to where the unknown awaited him. On the 9th of August, the ships approached the Canary Islands, and here a problem was discovered. The Pinta was leaking. Serious, long repairs were needed. They had to delay for almost 1 month. Columbus was nervous. Time was passing, and he was still in sight of European shores. But they could not rush. To set out into the ocean on a faulty vessel meant condemning people to death. Only on the 6th of September, when the Pinta was finally repaired, did the fleet head strictly west, away from the last patches of familiar land into the endless Atlantic. Ahead was only water, water to the horizon, water in all directions. Neither islands, nor shores, nor other ships. Only 3 small shells amidst a huge unknown sea. A favorable trade wind blew, constant, reliable, driving the ships west. The speed was good, from 80 to 220 kilometers per day. The Santa Maria, the Pinta, and the Nina flew across the waves like seabirds. The sea was surprisingly calm, the weather favorable. It seemed fate itself blessed this journey. The first days passed easily. The crew was enthusiastic, joking, singing songs. But gradually, as familiar land remained further and further behind, the mood began to change. People looked west with increasing anxiety. How much further to sail? When would land appear? What if Columbus was wrong in his calculations? On the 16th of September, the expedition reached the Sargasso Sea, a huge area of the ocean covered in floating seaweed. The green mass stretched to the horizon, thick, tangled, like a giant spider web. The seaweed rustled against the ship's bottoms, clinging to the rudders. The sailors were frightened. They thought a shoal was ahead, that the ships would soon be permanently stuck in this trap. Panicked talk began. But Columbus maintained his composure. He explained that the depth was sufficient, that the seaweed was not dangerous, that it was simply a natural phenomenon. He spoke confidently, firmly, and the crew gradually calmed down. The fleet continued its journey, making its way through the green sea. Days and weeks passed. Around them was only water, endless, monotonous, frightening in its infinity. Neither birds, nor fish, nor signs of land. Only sky and ocean, ocean and sky. Time dragged on wearily, slowly. Every day seemed like the previous one, the same sails, the same waves, the same unknown ahead. Columbus kept a detailed diary, recording the distance covered, the wind direction, the state of the sea. But he told the crew smaller figures. The men were told that 13 leagues had been covered, because they were constantly falsely told that they had covered less distance than the true distance, so that the journey might not seem long to them, he wrote in his diary. Although some historians believe that it was the opposite, he exaggerated the figures in his diary to later emphasize the scale of his achievement. By the end of September, the crew's patience began to run out. People complained more and more frequently. They whispered in corners, gathered in groups, discussing something, looking discontentedly toward the Admiral's cabin. They said, "We have been sailing for more than 1 month, and there is still no land. Maybe Columbus has gone mad. Maybe he is leading us to certain death. Maybe we should turn back before it is too late, while supplies last." On the 7th of October, Columbus changed course from west to west-southwest. Before this, the fleet had been moving approximately toward Florida. Now, it took a course toward the Bahama Islands. The Admiral did not explain the reason for the change. Perhaps he saw a flock of birds flying southwest and decided they were heading toward land. Perhaps intuition simply guided him. By this time, the tension on the ships had reached its limit. More than 1 month in the open ocean, neither shores, nor islands, nor signs of land. Water and food supplies were dwindling. People were tired of the rocking, the salt water, the monotony, the fear, the unknown. Open discussions about mutiny began. The sailors demanded they turn back to Spain, home. Someone suggested simply throwing Columbus overboard and taking command themselves. Captain Martin Alonso Pinzon of the Pinta hesitated. On the one hand, he supported the Admiral, but on the other, he understood that the crew was on the verge of mutiny. On the 10th of October, patience finally snapped. An open mutiny almost flared up on the Santa Maria. The sailors surrounded Columbus, shouting, demanding, threatening. The Admiral stood on the deck, short, with a graying beard, with burning, tired eyes, and pleaded. He begged them to endure a little longer. He promised that if land was not sighted in 3 days, just 3 days, they would turn back. He swore by his honor, by his faith, by everything he had. The crew reluctantly agreed. 3 days was the final deadline. If land did not appear by then, Columbus faced death, and the expedition would turn home. On the 11th of October, the first signs of approaching land appeared. Branches with green leaves, a carved stick, a fragment of a board were floating in the water. The crew's spirits lifted. So land was nearby. So Columbus was right. So they would not die in this cursed ocean. The night of the 11th to the 12th of October was anxious and tense. No one slept. Everyone watched ahead, peered into the darkness, trying to distinguish any outlines. At 2 o'clock in the night, the sailor on the Pinta, Rodrigo de Triana, who was on watch, suddenly spotted a dark strip ahead. He froze, disbelieving his eyes. Then he fired the cannon, the conventional signal, and shouted with all his might, "Land! Land! Tierra!" A commotion erupted on all 3 ships. People jumped out of their cabins, ran to the side, pointing ahead. Some cried with joy, some shouted, some thanked God. Columbus stood on the deck of the Santa Maria and also looked ahead. Tears streamed down his face. He had done it. He had proven he was right. He had found the western route to India. At dawn on the 12th of October, in the 1492nd year, a low sandy shore opened before the sailors. An island covered in lush greenery, washed by clear blue water. People stood on the shore, naked, with painted bodies, adorned with shells and feathers. They watched the ships with astonishment and fear. Columbus ordered the boats lowered. He himself dressed in his ceremonial doublet and took the royal banner of Castile. The Pinzon brothers also donned their best clothes and took up banners with the green cross. The boats reached the shore. Columbus was the first to step onto the sand, the first European on the soil of the New World. He knelt, kissed the earth, and thanked God with tears in his eyes. Then he stood up, planted the flag in the sand, and solemnly declared the island a possession of the Spanish crown. He named it San Salvador, Holy Savior. The sailors also fell to their knees, kissed the earth, crossed themselves, and sang prayers of thanks. This was one of the Bahama Islands, probably Guanahani. The local inhabitants, seeing that the strangers were peacefully inclined, grew bolder and approached. They were the Taino, one of the indigenous tribes of the Caribbean Sea. Of medium height, with copper-red skin, straight black hair, and dark eyes. They were almost naked, only cotton loincloths. Their bodies were painted with red and black dye, and they wore ornaments of shells, bone, and feathers in their ears and noses. The Spanish looked at them with curiosity and astonishment. The Taino looked at the Spanish with equal curiosity. They touched their clothes, thick, heavy, incomprehensible in the hot climate. They stared at their beards. The indigenous people rarely grew facial hair. They looked with delight and fear at the iron swords. They knew no metal, only stone, wood, and bone. The cross that Columbus held caused them confusion. Columbus, however, looked at them with completely different eyes. In his diary he recorded, "These are good people, without malice. They are easily converted to Christianity." He saw before him not equals, but simple savages who needed to be saved, enlightened, and led to the true faith. He saw future subjects of the Spanish crown, future Christians, future laborers in the mines and on the plantations. The Spanish began distributing gifts to the indigenous people, glass beads, small bells, red caps. The Taino rejoiced like children. For them, glass beads were treasures. The small bells were miracles emitting magical sounds. In return, they gave the Spanish everything they had: parrots in woven cages, balls of cotton thread, darts with stone tips. This was an exchange of gifts, the first contact between two worlds that had existed for centuries without knowing of each other. But Columbus was looking for neither parrots nor cotton. He was looking for gold. He constantly and obsessively questioned the indigenous people. Where was the gold? Was there gold here? Where could gold be obtained? The Taino did not fully understand what this strange bearded man wanted, but they saw how his eyes lit up at the sight of the tiny gold plates in their ornaments, and they pointed south. Using gesture language, they said that there, on the large islands, lived people with gold ornaments. On the 14th of October, the expedition moved on, from island to island. Columbus discovered the Bahama Islands one after another, giving them Spanish names and declaring them possessions of the crown. Everywhere, the picture was the same: poor villages of reed huts, naked, good-natured people, no gold. Only tiny ornaments, only promises that somewhere further away, on other islands, there was a lot of gold. On the 28th of October, the fleet reached a large island that Columbus named Juana, later to be called Cuba. The Admiral was absolutely certain that this was not an island, but a peninsula of Asia, and that the golden cities of China and Japan and the palaces of the Great Khan were nearby. He sent an embassy deep into the island with a letter to the ruler, whom he considered the Chinese emperor. The envoys returned after several days, reporting only poor indigenous villages. On the 6th of December, they discovered another large island, Haiti, which Columbus named Hispaniola, Little Spain. Here, the indigenous people wore gold ornaments, a little more than on the other islands, a few plates, a few tiny rings. But for Columbus, this was a sign. It meant gold existed. They just needed to find the source, the deposits, the mines. On the night of the 25th of December, on Christmas, disaster struck. The Santa Maria ran aground off the coast of Hispaniola. The ship could not be saved, reefs pierced the hull, and water rushed in. With the help of the local indigenous people, the Spanish salvaged everything valuable: cannons, supplies, tools. They built a fort from the wreckage of the Santa Maria on the shore, naming it La Navidad, Christmas. Now Columbus had only two ships left, the Pinta and the Niña. There was not enough room for everyone. 39 men agreed to stay in the fort, the first European settlement in the New World. Columbus armed the fort with the Santa Maria's cannons, left supplies for 1 year, and gave instructions to search for gold and establish friendly relations with the indigenous people. He promised to return as soon as possible with reinforcements. On the 4th of January, in the 1493rd year, taking several indigenous people with him as living proof of the discovery, Columbus set out on the return journey aboard the Niña. The Pinta, captained by Martin Alonso Pinzon, joined him. The return voyage was difficult. Storms, high waves, the constant fear that the small caravels would not hold up. On the 16th of March, in the 1493rd year, Columbus returned to Spain on the Niña. He brought a little gold, very little, only a few tiny ornaments. He brought 6 Taino indigenous people, frightened, not understanding what was happening to them, torn from their native lands. He brought exotic birds, parrots with bright feathers. He brought strange fruits, corn, sweet potato, tobacco. But most importantly, he brought news of the discovery, news of lands in the West, which he considered the outskirts of Asia, islands near India, of people who could be converted to Christianity and have their souls saved, of gold which, as he promised, was abundant there, needing only thorough searching. For the Spanish, Christopher Columbus became a hero, an explorer, a missionary, a man who opened a new route to the riches of the East, brought glory to Spain, and expanded the boundaries of the Christian world. He was met as a triumphant hero. His name was on everyone's lips. For the Taino indigenous people who remained on the islands, Columbus was a stranger, a man with iron and a cross, who brought incomprehensible promises and terrible premonitions. They did not yet know that the encounter with these bearded men on strange floating houses would mark the beginning of the end of their world. The psychological collapse occurred here, on these first islands, in the first days of contact. Two worlds collided and looked at each other with completely different eyes. The Spanish saw a noble mission to bring the light of Christianity, civilization, and salvation. The indigenous people saw a threat, people who were searching for something unknown, who looked at them strangely, who wanted to take something away. Columbus recorded in his diary that the indigenous people were good, meek, and easily converted to Christianity. But he immediately added, "They will make good servants." A missionary and a slave trader in one person, a savior of souls and a hunter of gold, a man of the Renaissance era with all its contradictions. One world looked at the other and was already doomed. Because the meeting was not one of equals. It was the meeting of iron and stone, of cannons and bows, of diseases and defenselessness. And the outcome of this meeting was predetermined from the very beginning. The 12th of October, in the 1492nd year, marked the beginning of a new era in the history of humanity, an era that some would call the age of great geographical discoveries, and others, the beginning of the greatest tragedy, an era whose consequences we feel to this day. When in the spring of the 1493rd year Christopher Columbus returned to Spain, he was received as a hero. Barcelona, where the royal court was at the time, rejoiced. The streets were decorated with flags, and people came out to welcome the explorer. Columbus rode into the city on horseback, surrounded by his retinue. Behind him were carried cages with unseen bright parrots, gold ornaments, tiny plates and rings, strange fruits, corn, sweet potato, chili pepper, and most importantly, they led 6 Taino indigenous people in loincloths with painted bodies. King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella received Columbus with honors never accorded to a mere sailor. The Admiral spoke of his journey, of the lands in the West, of the good people without malice, who would easily convert to Christianity. He spoke of gold, although he brought very little gold. He promised that this was only the beginning, that there were untold quantities on the islands needing only organized extraction. Isabella and Ferdinand listened carefully. They were impressed. Columbus had indeed found new lands, even if not exactly those he had promised. Portugal was already laying claim to the newly discovered territories, citing previous papal bulls. It was necessary to act quickly, secure Spanish rights, and establish permanent colonies. The second expedition was prepared completely differently than the first. It was no longer a risky attempt by 3 old caravels. It was a true military operation. 17 ships, from large galleons to small caravels, between 1,500 and 2,500 people, according to various sources. Not just sailors, soldiers, priests, officials, adventurers, and younger sons of noble families who had missed out on inheritance and dreamed of getting rich in the new lands. Horses were loaded onto the ships, a military advantage the indigenous people had never seen. Also donkeys, cows, pigs to breed in the colonies, seeds of wheat, barley, grapes, to turn these lands into a semblance of Spain. Cannons, arquebuses, crossbows, swords, and armor, everything for conquest and defense. On the 25th of September, in the 1493rd year, the fleet sailed from Cadiz. This time the journey was shorter and easier. Columbus knew the way, knew the winds and currents. They crossed the Atlantic in just 20 days, almost twice as fast as the first time. On the 3rd of November, land appeared ahead, the island of Dominica, one of the Lesser Antilles. The expedition moved north, discovering island after island, Montserrat, Antigua, Nevis, an archipelago that Columbus romantically named 11,000 Virgins. On the 19th of November, they reached the large island of Puerto Rico. Everywhere the Spanish landed, declared the lands a possession of the crown and searched for gold. They questioned the local residents, sometimes by force, sometimes with gifts. On the 27th of November, the fleet approached Hispaniola, Haiti, where the Santa Maria had been wrecked a year earlier and where 39 men had remained to build the La Navidad fortress. Columbus was anxious. How were his men? Had they found gold? Had they established friendly relations with the indigenous people? When the ships approached the site where the fortress should have been, there was no one on the shore. A reconnaissance party was sent out. It returned with terrible news. In place of La Navidad were only charred remnants, ashes, and garbage. Not a single Spaniard was alive. Only bodies scattered in the thickets, already semi-decomposed. The local cacique, Guacanagari, who had greeted Columbus amicably a year earlier, sent envoys with explanations. He recounted that all the Spanish had been killed by the warriors of another chief, Caonabo, ruler of the mountainous region of Maguana. Guacanagari himself, he claimed, tried to defend the white men and was wounded in the battle. Columbus brought the ship's doctor to him. Guacanagari lay there, demonstrating bandages on his leg. The doctor removed the bandage. No wounds. The pretense was exposed. Under pressure, seeing that the deception was revealed, Guacanagari confessed what had truly happened. The Spanish left at La Navidad had behaved like conquerors, not guests. They robbed villages, took food, raped women, and demanded gold. The indigenous people endured, but patience has its limits. When several Spanish men went into the mountains to search for gold mines in Caonabo's territory, he killed them, and then his warriors attacked the fortress at night when everyone was asleep. They burned it to the ground and killed every single person. Columbus did not punish Guacanagari immediately, at least not right away. It was necessary to found a new settlement, more secure, stronger. They searched for a suitable location for several days. They found a convenient bay 120 kilometers from the burned fortress. There, they founded a city they called La Isabela, in honor of the Queen, the first European city in the New World. But everything went wrong from the start. The adventurers, the younger sons of noble families, who had come for easy gold and quick glory, refused to work. They considered it beneath them to dig the earth, build houses, or grow food. They expected the indigenous people to do everything for them. Priests tried to baptize the natives, but they did not understand why they needed a foreign god. Soldiers demanded spoils, gold, and slaves. The climate of Hispaniola proved harsh for Europeans. Heat, humidity, tropical diseases, malaria, yellow fever, dysentery decimated the colonists. Famine began. The Spanish were unaccustomed to the local food. Corn and sweet potatoes seemed repulsive to them. Wheat brought from Europe grew poorly in the tropical climate. Columbus sent detachments in search of gold. Horsemen on horses, unseen animals there that inspired sacred terror in the indigenous people, with arquebuses and war dogs rode through the villages. They demanded to be shown where the gold was. The indigenous people tried to explain that they had little gold, only tiny grains of sand in the rivers. But the Spanish did not believe them. They were convinced that the indigenous people were hiding treasures. Robbery and violence began. If a village refused to give food or gold, the Spanish took it by force. They burned huts, killed those who resisted, and enslaved the rest. War dogs were unleashed on the people. These huge mastiffs were trained to kill. In the 1494th year, Columbus organized the first true slave hunt. He loaded 500 indigenous people, men, women, and children, onto ships and sent them to Spain for sale. Many died en route from disease and despair. Columbus justified this by needing to recoup the expedition's costs, as he had not found the promised gold. Moreover, he showed a strange cunning in matters of faith. He refused to baptize the indigenous people in the New World so that he could enslave the pagans, but sent them to Spain for baptism, already as slaves. In the 1495th year, Columbus introduced a new cruel law. Every indigenous person over the age of 14 was obligated to pay the Spanish a certain amount of gold every 3 months, roughly as much as fit in a small bell, or 25 pounds of cotton, if they lived in an area without gold. Those who paid were given a copper token to wear around their neck, a kind of permission to live for 3 more months. If the token was overdue or lost, the indigenous person had both hands chopped off and was left to bleed to death. The law was impossible to fulfill. There was very little gold on the island, only tiny grains of sand in the river sediment. To collect the required amount, people had to stand waist-deep in cold water all day long, washing the soil, neglecting fields, hunting, fishing, and family. Many preferred to flee to the mountains. There they were hunted down with dogs and killed on the spot or returned to work. Famine began. The indigenous people, having abandoned their fields to search for gold, could not feed themselves. Weak, hungry, and demoralized people became easy prey for diseases brought by the Europeans. Smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza. The indigenous people had no immunity against them. Diseases decimated entire villages. People died by the hundreds, by the thousands. The Spanish entertained themselves by inventing sophisticated cruelties. They argued over who could cleave a person in half with a single sword stroke. They hanged indigenous people in rows of 13 in honor of Christ and the 12 apostles. They burned people alive over a slow fire. They smashed children against rocks. Pregnant women had their bellies ripped open. Cacique Caonabo, who dared to be the first to raise a hand against the Spanish, was captured by cunning. They promised peace and friendship, lured him into a trap, shackled him, and sent him to Spain. He died en route, never making it to trial. In the 1498th year, the law on forced labor was officially introduced. The encomienda system appeared. The Spanish crown distributed land to the colonists along with the indigenous people living on it. Formally, this was called guardianship or trusteeship. By law, the encomendero, the owner of the encomienda, was supposed to care for his wards, teach them the Christian faith, and protect them from enemies. In return, the indigenous people were obligated to pay tax and labor on the master's fields. On paper, this looked almost noble. In reality, the encomienda was a form of slavery. Indigenous people worked for 300 days a year in mines, plantations, and construction. They were paid pennies, 14 to 18 pesos for an entire year of backbreaking labor, and from this sum, a tax of 8 pesos and a fee of 3 pesos for clothing were deducted. In the end, a person received virtually nothing for a whole year of forced labor, perhaps just enough to buy a knife or a piece of cloth. Many received nothing at all. The encomenderos found ways to cheat, fail to pay, or forget the debt. A strange, monstrous dialectic, faith and greed mixed into one bloody tangle. Spain acted under the banner of the cross. Every expedition began with a prayer. Every conquest was justified by the need to spread Christianity. Priests baptized indigenous people before they were sold into slavery. Soldiers hanged people in honor of Christ. Colonists prayed before burning a village. Columbus sincerely considered himself a missionary, a messenger of God. He wrote to the monarchs that the more pagans were transported to a Catholic country, the more souls would be saved. But gold became an obsession for him. He did not want to admit that he was wrong, that there were no untold riches on the islands. He continued to promise that they would soon find mines, that ships would soon return to Spain laden with gold to the gunwales. The sword and the cross, gold and prayer, everything merged into one. The tragedy began, destined to last for centuries. The colonial model born on Hispaniola would spread throughout the Americas. Conquistadors would arrive in Mexico, Peru, Chile. The empires of the Aztecs, Incas, and Mayas would be destroyed. Millions of people would perish from diseases, famine, and unbearable labor. And it all started here, on this small island in the Caribbean Sea. With a dream of India that turned into a nightmare, with a man who believed he was bringing the light of Christianity but brought only darkness and death. With the first encounter of two worlds, when the Spanish handed out glass beads to the indigenous people, and the indigenous people gave parrots, it seemed like the start of friendship. But a few years later, one of those worlds would begin to disappear from the face of the earth. The history of Hispaniola is the story of how greed triumphs over faith, how gold proves stronger than the cross, how good intentions turn into hell on earth, and how a man can justify any cruelty in the name of God. By the end of the 90s of the 15th century, Hispaniola, the island we now know as Haiti and the Dominican Republic, had turned into a veritable hell on earth. The Spanish built cities, churches, forts, and established fields. Outwardly, everything looked like the beginning of a new civilization. But beneath this veneer of order, something monstrous was happening, what historians would later call genocide. The encomienda system, officially introduced in the 1498th year, became the heart of the colonial regime. The word encomienda came from the Spanish verb encomendar, to entrust, to commit. In form, it was guardianship. In essence, it was slavery with a Christian face. The Spanish crown distributed tracts of land to the colonists, along with the indigenous people living on them. The encomendero, the owner of the encomienda, received not ownership of the people, but the right to demand labor and taxes from them. In return, he was obligated to care for his wards, teach them the Christian faith, and assimilate them into civilization. On paper, everything looked reasonable, even humane. In practice, indigenous people worked for 300 days a year in mines, plantations, construction, and fishing. Women labored in the fields with infants strapped to their backs, collapsing from exhaustion under the scorching sun. Men spent months in mountain mines without daylight, breathing dust, carrying baskets of ore on their backs. Children were used for small tasks that did not require great strength. They were paid pennies, 14 to 18 pesos, for an entire year of backbreaking labor. But from this sum, a tax of 8 pesos, a fee of 3 pesos for clothing, and several more pesos for food were deducted. In the end, a person received almost nothing for a whole year of forced labor, perhaps just enough to buy a knife or a piece of cloth. Many received nothing at all, The encomenderos found ways to cheat, fail to pay, or forget the debt. At the very beginning of the 16th century, a young priest named Bartolomé de las Casas arrived on Hispaniola. He was about 30 years old, the son of a conquistador and an encomendero himself. He came with the dream of bringing the word of God to the indigenous people to save souls. What he saw profoundly shocked him. Las Casas recorded eyewitness testimonies, and he himself witnessed many events. He saw the Spanish entertaining themselves by arguing over who could cleave a person in half with a single sword stroke, how they hanged indigenous people in rows of 13 in honor of Christ and the 12 apostles, how they burned people alive over a slow fire, listening to their screams, how they unleashed war dogs on the defenseless, huge mastiffs specially trained to kill people. Conquistador Roque Martin kept parts of dismembered indigenous bodies on the porch of his house to feed his dogs, as if they were carcasses of wild beasts or pork shoulders. For one Spaniard killed, 100 indigenous people were killed in retaliation, not those who committed the murder, but simply the first ones they found, for intimidation. Children were grabbed by the feet and smashed against rocks. Pregnant women had their bellies ripped open to see or argue about whether it was a boy or a girl. Infants were burned with their mothers. Las Casas wrote about mass suicides. Indigenous people drank the juice of the poisonous manioc tree. Death from it was agonizing, but seemed preferable to life under Spanish rule. They hanged themselves in entire families, husband, wife, children, on one tree. Women killed their children so that they would not fall into the hands of the white men. Mothers drowned infants in rivers, preferring to see them dead rather than slaves. Entire villages died out, from hunger, disease, despair, simply from loss of the will to live. When Columbus arrived on Hispaniola, in the 1492nd year, between 300,000 and 500,000 Taino indigenous people lived there, according to various estimates. By the 1515th year, 23 years later, only about 50,000 remained. By the middle of the 16th century, about 5,000. By the 1650th year, the Taino people had ceased to exist, completely, absolutely, without a trace, wiped from the face of the earth, as if they had never been. And what about Columbus himself? Admiral of the ocean sea, viceroy, and governor of all discovered lands? He proved to be a disastrously poor administrator, a brilliant navigator, a passionate dreamer, a fanatic of faith, but an absolutely incapable governor of people. The colony under his leadership descended into chaos. Colonists complained about food shortages, diseases, arbitrary rule, and brutal punishments for the slightest offenses. They complained that Columbus ruled like a tyrant, executing people without trial or investigation, torturing and starving even his own compatriots. Archival documents, found by researchers at the beginning of the 21st century, reveal a gruesome picture. 48 pages of witness statements from 23 Spanish people accused Columbus and his brothers, Bartolomé and Diego, whom he appointed as his deputies, of incredible cruelty. This cruelty was directed not only toward the indigenous people, but also toward the Spanish themselves. Columbus personally administered justice, recognizing no laws except his own will. He executed people without trial for the slightest disobedience, for criticism, for discontent. He orchestrated public floggings in the town square. Men and women, noble hidalgos and common sailors were whipped. He ordered noses and ears cut off for theft. He ordered one woman to be stripped naked and paraded through the town on a donkey simply for saying that the Admiral was of low birth. There is evidence that in a fit of rage he personally beat his own brother-in-law. the husband of his sister Bianchella, to death for some offense. Settlers lived in poverty and hardship, starved and died of disease, while Columbus and his brothers wallowed in luxury, failing to share supplies. What particularly outraged the colonists was that the Admiral did not allow the baptism of the indigenous people on the island. He explained this by saying they first needed to be prepared to accept the faith, to be taught the basics of Christianity. But everyone understood the true reason. Christians could not be turned into slaves according to church law. Therefore, Columbus sent the indigenous people to Spain for baptism there, already as slaves. He organized hunts for people, treating them like wild animals. He gave indigenous people as gifts to his associates, like livestock. While formally prohibiting enslavement, he said that the indigenous people should be free subjects of the Spanish crown. But in practice, he encouraged a system that was slavery under a different name. Columbus became paranoid. He saw conspiracies and betrayals everywhere. He suppressed any dissent with incredible cruelty. Several times, rebellions flared up against him and his brothers among the colonists. People simply could no longer endure the tyranny. Columbus drowned these mutinies in blood. Thus, the myth of the monster was born, of the great navigator who discovered new lands but turned them into hell, of the man who came to bring the light of Christianity but brought only darkness and death. Complaints from the colonists flowed continuously to Madrid. The royal couple tolerated it for a long time. After all, Columbus had opened new lands for them. But patience has its limits, and here is the paradox. A terrible, incomprehensible paradox. Columbus remained a deeply religious person until the end of his days. He prayed every day, often for long periods, on his knees, fervently. He read sacred texts, always carried the Bible with him. He wrote religious treatises in which he argued that the discovery of the Indies was part of God's plan for the salvation of humanity. He was absolutely convinced that he was fulfilling the will of the Lord, that everything he did was in the name of the faith. He sincerely considered himself a savior of souls, a missionary, a messenger of the Almighty. In his view, cruelty was necessary for the higher purpose. The indigenous people had to be forced to work so they would become useful members of society. The disobedient had to be punished so that others would see and fear. Gold had to be sought to finance the crusade for the liberation of Jerusalem. All of this, in his eyes, was justified by the higher goal, the spread of Christianity. How can a person kill in the name of Christ? How can the cross bless the sword? How does faith turn into justification for genocide? How can one pray before giving the order to hang 20 people? Bartolomé de las Casas, having seen everything with his own eyes, went through a spiritual crisis. In the 1514th year, during confession, he suddenly realized that he himself was part of this system of evil, that owning an encomienda made him an accomplice to genocide. He freed his indigenous people, relinquished the encomienda, and dedicated the rest of his life to defending the native peoples. Las Casas returned to Spain and became a true champion for the rights of the indigenous people. He wrote treatises, spoke at court, and sought audiences with the king. He published the book A Short Account of the Destruction of the Indies, one of the most horrifying testimonies of human cruelty in history. Largely thanks to his efforts, the new laws were adopted in the 1542nd year, which formally prohibited the enslavement of indigenous people and at least somewhat limited the power of the encomenderos. But it was already too late. Too late. The process of annihilation of the peoples of the Caribbean islands was already irreversible. Hispaniola, once a flourishing island with dense forests, clear rivers, and hundreds of villages, became the grave of an entire people. And Christopher Columbus, the dreamer with burning eyes, the man who believed he would change the world for the better, turned into a symbol of how a great dream can give birth to a great nightmare, how good intentions pave the road to hell, how faith and cruelty can coexist in one person without contradicting each other in his own eyes. The history of the first colonies is the history of what happens when two civilizations with different levels of technology meet. When iron meets stone, cannons meet bows, diseases meet defenselessness. And the history of how any system, even one created with good intentions, can turn into a mechanism of destruction if there are no checks and balances, if power is unlimited, if people cease to be seen as people. By the end of the 90s of the 15th century, complaints began pouring into Madrid. Many complaints, bitter, angry, desperate, written by hands trembling with rage. The colonists of Hispaniola wrote to the king and queen, reporting the cruelty of Columbus and his brothers, the arbitrary rule, the executions without trial, the hunger and the diseases. They complained that the promised untold riches had still not been found. There was almost no gold, and the Admiral himself ruled the colony like an oriental despot who recognized no laws. Noble hidalgos, whom Columbus, the upstart, the son of a Genoese weaver, humiliated and punished, complained. Simple colonists, whom he starved and forced to hard labor alongside the indigenous people, complained. Even priests complained, unable to reconcile themselves to the Admiral's prohibition on baptizing the indigenous people, turning missionary activity into a farce. Ferdinand and Isabella endured it for a long time. Columbus had opened new lands for them, even if not the ones he promised, not India with its spices and silks, but still new territories, new subjects, new opportunities. Moreover, they had invested enormous sums in his expeditions. 2 large expeditions, thousands of people, ships, supplies. They wanted to believe that the investment would pay off. But the monarch's patience was not infinite either. The treasury received almost no income from the colonies. Little gold was sent, certainly not the quantities the Admiral had promised. Colonists died of disease and starvation instead of working and bringing profit. And then the Portuguese Vasco da Gama, in the 1498th year, discovered the sea route to the real India, circumnavigated Africa, and returned with ships heavy with spices and jewels. It became definitively clear Columbus had deceived them. The lands he discovered were definitely not Asia, not the outskirts of the Chinese Empire. In May of the 1499th year, the monarchs made a decision. They appointed a special inspector, a royal commissioner with extraordinary powers, to find out what was truly happening on Hispaniola. The choice fell on Francisco de Bobadilla, commander of the military order of Calatrava, a man of noble birth, an experienced administrator, known for his principled nature and harshness. Bobadilla was given the title of second governor of the Spanish possessions in America and virtually unlimited powers. He could arrest, judge, dismiss officials, confiscate property, everything necessary to restore order in the colony. The king and queen were tired of complaints, tired of disappointments. They finally wanted to see results. In August of the 1500th year, Bobadilla, with a detachment of 500 soldiers on 2 caravels, entered the harbor of Santo Domingo, the capital of Hispaniola. The first thing he saw upon entering the port shocked him profoundly. A gallows stood on the shore, right in front of the governor's palace. Hanging on it were the corpses of 7 executed Spanish men, not indigenous people, but Spanish men. The corpses swung in the wind, and crows circled above them. Bobadilla landed on the shore, where he was met by Diego Columbus, the Admiral's younger brother, who governed the city in Christopher's absence. When asked by the commissioner about the hanged men, Diego replied calmly, without a hint of embarrassment, that they were executed rebels, and 5 more would be executed tomorrow. They were currently in prison, awaiting their fate. Bobadilla was enraged. By what right did the Columbuses execute Spanish subjects without trial? Where were the investigation protocols? Where were the sentences? Where were any documents? He demanded the prisoners be immediately handed over to him. Diego refused. He said he would do nothing until the return of the Admiral, who was on an expedition somewhere deep in the island. Only Christopher had the right to give such orders. This was an open challenge to royal authority. An infuriated Bobadilla ordered the royal decree detailing his powers to be read aloud to the assembled residents. He called upon the colonists to obey him as the representative of the monarchs. Then, with a detachment of soldiers, he stormed the citadel where Diego had taken refuge and put him in chains. When Christopher Columbus returned from his expedition and appeared in Santo Domingo, he was met with the stunning news. His brother was arrested, and some Bobadilla had declared himself the new governor. The admiral was furious. Who was this upstart? How dared he arrest the brother of the viceroy? Columbus immediately went to Bobadilla demanding an explanation. The meeting was brief and humiliating. Bobadilla listened to the outraged admiral coldly, without any reverence for his titles. Then he read the royal decree, which granted him, Bobadilla, full authority over the colonies, and he ordered Christopher Columbus to be arrested, shackled, and imprisoned. There was still one brother free, Bartolomé, the adelantado of Hispaniola, who had armed men. He was somewhere on the island with his detachment. When Bartolomé learned of his brother's arrest, he could have tried to free them by force. He had loyal men, weapons, and experience. Armed conflict, bloodshed, could have begun. But Christopher sent a message to his brother from prison, to surrender, not to resist, to trust that the monarchs would sort things out, restore justice, and punish this impostor Bobadilla. Bartolomé submitted to the will of his older brother. He came to Santo Domingo and voluntarily handed himself over to the commissioner. He was also shackled. Bobadilla began an investigation. He questioned witnesses, collected documents, and recorded statements. Witnesses came forward one after another. 23 people gave sworn testimonies, 48 pages of accusations. Their testimonies painted a nightmarish picture. Columbus and his brothers were accused of incredible cruelty, not only toward the indigenous people, but also toward the Spanish themselves. Witnesses recounted how the admiral executed people without trial for the slightest disobedience, for criticism, simply for discontent. How he orchestrated public floggings in the town square. Men and women, noble hidalgos and common sailors were whipped. How he ordered noses and ears cut off for petty theft. How he ordered one woman to be stripped naked and paraded through the entire city on a donkey just because she said the admiral was of low birth. They recounted how, in a fit of rage, Christopher Columbus personally beat his own brother-in-law, the husband of his sister Bianchella, to death. How colonists died of starvation and disease, while the Columbus family lived in luxury, failing to share food supplies. How the admiral gave indigenous people as gifts to his associates, like livestock. How he organized hunts for people with dogs. In early October of the 1500th year, Bobadilla made a decision. All 3 Columbus brothers were put aboard the Caravel La Gorda, the fat one, in chains. The captain of the ship was Andres Martin, an experienced sailor, a man with a kind heart. As soon as the vessel left the harbor and was out of sight of land, he approached Columbus and offered to remove the chains. He said that he had the right to do so, that he was the captain, and his will governed his ship. But Columbus resolutely refused. He said firmly, harshly, with pride in his voice, I am shackled in the name of their royal highnesses, the kings of Spain, and I will wear these shackles until they themselves order them removed. No one else has the right to free me, except those who ordered me chained." The great navigator spent more than 1 month in chains. First on the ship, in a cramped cabin where light barely penetrated. Then, when La Gorda docked on the shores of Spain, in the Las Cuevas monastery in Seville, where he was detained. The Admiral of the Ocean Sea, the viceroy of all discovered lands, a man who just a few years earlier had been met as a hero in Barcelona, sat in a monastery cell in chains. This was a humiliation, terrible, public, unbearable. The whole city spoke of Columbus's downfall. Some gloated, saying he got what he deserved, a tyrant and a despot. Others sympathized. After all, a great man, discoverer of new lands. How could he be treated this way? Still others simply discussed, wondered, and spread rumors. From the monastery cell, Columbus wrote letters to the monarchs, friends, patrons, everyone who had ever helped him. He wrote with a hand trembling with anger and resentment, in large, uneven letters. He defended himself, explained, and pleaded for justice. In one of the letters, he appealed to Isabella, "I served the faith and the crown. I discovered new lands, brought glory to Spain, expanded the boundaries of the Christian world. I acted in the name of the Lord. I carried out God's will." He wrote that everything he was accused of was lies, slanders by the envious and the discontented, that he punished only the guilty, the rebels, the thieves, the traitors. That order in a colony populated by adventurers and convicts could only be maintained with a firm hand, that he had done everything he could under unbearable conditions, hunger, disease, lack of support from the metropolis. On the 17th of December, in the 1500th year, more than 2 months after his arrest, Christopher Columbus and his brothers were finally brought to Granada, where the royal court was located. They were led to the royal couple still in chains. The Admiral entered the throne room, dragging his chains that clanked on the stone floor. He looked aged, emaciated, gray hair, wrinkles, a hunched back. But his eyes still burned, still looked straight ahead, without fear. Columbus fell to his knees before Isabella and Ferdinand and kissed their hands, and then his composure broke. With tears streaming down his wrinkled face, he apologized, defended himself, and recounted how he had tried to govern the colony under impossible conditions, how he fought against rebels, lazy idlers who wanted only gold but refused to work, how he had been betrayed, slandered, and humiliated. Isabella wept. She had always sympathized with Columbus, believing in his mission. Ferdinand was colder, more calculating, but he too was touched by the sight of the great man's downfall. The monarchs listened to the Admiral. They immediately ordered the chains removed. They announced the restoration of all the income and privileges Columbus had been deprived of upon his arrest. They returned his titles and his right to 1/10 of the income from trade with the new lands. But, and this was the crucial but, he was not returned to the post of Viceroy of Hispaniola. This post remained with Bobadilla and later passed to another governor. Moreover, Columbus's rights to govern the lands he had discovered were suspended. He retained the title of Admiral and the right to income, but lost real power. The reason was simple and harsh. By this time it was clear that Columbus had discovered not just an island off the coast of Asia, it was an entire continent, a vast territory whose wealth was yet to be estimated, and the crown was not going to allow one man and his heirs to eternally rule such a vast territory. 1/10 of all trade, control over all income, the right to appoint all officials, that was too much. Too expensive for the crown. Furthermore, Columbus had proven he was a disastrously poor administrator. The colony under his leadership was mired in chaos, brought no profit, only problems and complaints. The path to administrative structures in the Spanish possessions in America was closed to him forever. Columbus was crushed by this decision. He was already about 50, almost an old man by 16th century standards. His health was seriously undermined. Tropical fevers, arthritis, which crippled his fingers and made every movement agonizing. His glory had faded. A huge part of his fortune was lost, although the 10th still brought income. His titles were formally preserved, but real power was taken away. But most importantly, he felt betrayed. Everything he had dedicated his life to, all the sacrifices, all the suffering, all the triumphs, all ended in arrest in chains, public humiliation, and exile from the lands he had discovered. He gave Spain an entire continent, and what did he get in return? Chains, shame, oblivion. Columbus kept the shackles in which he was brought from Hispaniola until the end of his life. He kept them in his room as a reminder of the injustice, as a testament to his suffering, as an accusation against those who treated him so. In his will, he stipulated that they should be buried with him. The historical paradox, a monstrous, bitter, unjust paradox. The man who discovered an entire continent for Europe was exiled from that continent in chains. The one who dreamed of becoming the great ruler of new lands proved incapable of managing even one island. The one who believed he was bringing the light of Christianity turned out to be an accomplice, albeit unintentionally, to genocide. But Columbus was not going to give up. Even now, broken, humiliated, sick, he did not abandon his dream. He pleaded, begged, and sought permission for a new expedition. One more chance, one more journey, a final journey in which he would prove to everyone that he had been right. To prove that the lands he discovered truly were the route to Asia, to find the strait that led to the Indian Ocean, to finally find the gold he had promised 10 years earlier, to reclaim his glory, honor, and good name. The king and queen, seeing his persistence, his unbroken will, gave their consent. In the 1502nd year, 1.5 years after his arrest, Christopher Columbus set out on his fourth and final voyage. But this was no longer the triumphant expedition of an explorer. It was the desperate attempt of a broken man to prove that his life had not been in vain. Herein lay the tragic irony of Christopher Columbus's fate. He never understood what he had discovered. Until his last breath, until the last beat of his heart, he was convinced that he had reached islands near Asia, that he had found the western route to India, that his lands were the outskirts of the great continent described by Marco Polo. He died in ignorance, never knowing the truth. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic Ocean lay an entire new world, 2 vast continents whose existence Europeans did not even suspect. Not just islands, not just another archipelago off the coast of China, but the 4th part of the world, unimaginably large, inhabited by many peoples, with their empires, cities, cultures, and histories. Columbus sought India, China, and Japan. He sought the gold of Cipangu, described by Marco Polo, the palaces of the great Khan covered in gold. He sought spices, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, pepper, for which fabulous prices were paid in Europe. He sought the silk and pearls of the East, and he did not find them because he was searching in completely the wrong place. The one who understood the truth bore a different name, Amerigo Vespucci, a Florentine merchant, navigator, and astronomer, a man of keen intellect, an observant researcher with a scientific mindset. He was born on the 9th of March in the 1454th year in Florence, into a notary's family. He received an excellent education, studying Latin, geography, astronomy, and navigation. In the 1492nd year, the Medici trading house sent Vespucci to Spain, to the residences in Cadiz and Seville. There he managed ship provisioning and participated in the preparation of Columbus's second and third voyages. He listened to the stories of navigators about the new lands, studied the maps they brought back, and he developed a desire to sail across the ocean himself. In the late 90s of the 15th century, Vespucci participated in several expeditions to the shores of what everyone still believed was Asia. On the 20th of May, in the 1499th year, he sailed from Puerto de Santa Maria near Cadiz with Admiral Alonso de Ojeda, the same man who had sailed with Columbus on the second expedition. They crossed the Atlantic on 4 ships in 23.5 days. On the 12th of June, they stepped ashore at 3 degrees north latitude, approximately where Suriname is today. Vespucci traveled along the coast of South America, discovered the mouth of the great Amazon River, and explored the northern Brazilian coast. He entered the Gulf of Maracaibo, where he found an indigenous settlement on stilts in the middle of the water and named the place Venezuela, Little Venice. In June of the 1500th year, he returned to Cadiz. In the 1501st to 2nd years, Vespucci made another voyage, this time under the Portuguese flag. He surveyed a massive stretch of the Brazilian coast, advancing far south, perhaps as far as 32 degrees south latitude, and according to some sources, even 52 degrees. And Vespucci understood. He understood what Columbus did not. This was not Asia. The shores stretched too far south, much further than Asia should extend according to all known maps. The climate was completely different. The stars in the southern hemisphere were unfamiliar, the constellations unseen. The peoples were unlike the descriptions of the Chinese or the Indians. This was something entirely different. On the 22nd of July, in the 1502nd year, a battered caravel with Vespucci aboard docked in Lisbon. He brought detailed maps, observation records, proofs, and most importantly, he brought a new understanding. This was not the eastern edge of India. This was Novus Mundus, the New World, the fourth part of the world, unknown to the ancients, not marked on any map. Vespucci wrote letters to friends and patrons in which he described his voyages in detail. Letters to Lorenzo de' Medici and Piero Soderini, the ruler of Florence. In them, he shared his observations, described the nature of the new lands, the people, and the enormous distances. These letters were published and circulated throughout Europe in huge print runs. People read them and were astonished. An entire continent, a new world. In the 1507th year, the German cartographer Martin Waldseemüller from the small town of Saint-Dié in Lorraine was working on a new map of the world. He carefully studied Vespucci's letters, compared them with Columbus's maps and the accounts of other navigators, and he made a revolutionary decision. On the southern continent across the ocean, he wrote the new name, America. In the commentary accompanying the map, Waldseemüller wrote, "Now these parts of the world are completely discovered, and another fourth part has been found by Amerigo Vespucci. Since Asia and Africa are named after women, I see no reason why this new land should not be called America, the land of Americus, in honor of Americus, a man of outstanding shrewdness who discovered it." And so it was. The name quickly caught on and spread across European maps. Initially, only South America, the part Vespucci explored, was called America. Then the name spread to the northern continent as well. By the middle of the 16th century, both continents bore the name of the Florentine navigator. And here is the irony of fate, a monstrous, unjust irony. The continent discovered by Christopher Columbus bears the name of another man, the one who was not the first, who did not risk his life in the unknown like Columbus, but the one who understood the essence of the discovery, the one who first realized that this was not Asia, but something entirely new. However, some historians believe that the continent might have been named for another reason, possibly in honor of the English patron Richard Amerigo of Bristol, who funded John Cabot's expedition in the 1497th year. In the Bristol calendar for that year, there is a note. On the day of St. John the Baptist, the land America was found by merchants from Bristol. According to this theory, Vespucci simply took this name as a nickname. But this theory is less widespread and accepted among scholars. The discovery of America revolutionized the European worldview. Previously, educated people knew only three parts of the world: Europe, Asia, and Africa. The world seemed known, studied, described by the ancients. Now a fourth part of the world appeared, about which neither Aristotle nor Ptolemy knew. Maps had to be redrawn from scratch. Geographers, philosophers, and theologians debated, how was this possible? Why did the Bible not mention these lands? Where did the people there come from, if all people originated from Adam and lived in the three known parts of the world? Scholars realized the world was much larger than they thought. The globe had completely different dimensions than Columbus had calculated. The oceans were wider, the continents larger, and most importantly, so much was still unknown. If an entire continent existed that no one knew about, what else might be hidden beyond the horizon? This was a revolution comparable to man's flight into space in the 20th century. Humanity literally expanded its horizons. The Earth became larger. History was divided into before and after. The age of great geographical discoveries began as Europeans explored, mapped, and conquered increasingly new territories. The discovery of America changed not only geography, but also the economy of Europe. Wealth flowed from the New World: gold, silver from the mines of Mexico and Peru, new plants, unseen animals, potato, corn, tomatoes, tobacco, cocoa. All this came to Europe from America and changed people's lives. The price revolution began as the influx of American silver devalued European money and reorganized the entire economic system. The discovery of America marked the beginning of globalization. For the first time in human history, the world became one. Europe, Asia, Africa, America became connected by trade, migration, and cultural exchange. The colonial era began, which would last 4 centuries. But at what cost? What a terrible, monstrous, irreparable cost. When Columbus landed on the Caribbean islands in the 1492nd year, about 100 million people lived in the Americas. Great empires of the Aztecs, Incas, and Mayas existed. Hundreds of peoples with developed cultures, their own writing systems, astronomy, and architecture. Cities that could rival European ones in size and splendor. People who had lived on these lands for centuries, millennia, creating civilizations, writing history. A century after the arrival of the Europeans, only about 10 million remained. 90% of the indigenous population perished, 9 out of 10 people. This is the most terrible demographic catastrophe in the history of humanity, primarily from diseases, smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, which Europeans brought with them without even knowing it. The indigenous people had no immunity to these diseases. Epidemics wiped out entire cities, entire peoples. Sometimes the disease preceded the conquistadors. They arrived in a valley and found only dead villages. From famine, when the Spanish took all the food, forcing the indigenous people to abandon their fields for work in the mines. From unbearable labor on plantations and in mines, where people died of exhaustion and lung diseases. From direct killings, torture, executions, and genocide. Entire peoples vanished from the face of the earth, as if they had never existed. The Taino on the Caribbean islands, completely erased in 1.5 centuries. The Aztec Empire in Mexico, destroyed by Hernán Cortés in the 1521st year. The Inca Empire in Peru, annihilated by Francisco Pizarro in the 30s of the 16th century. Cities destroyed, temples burned, books, the few Mayan and Aztec codices where their history was recorded, almost all destroyed by Spanish priests as devilish writings. The transatlantic slave trade began. When the indigenous people started dying out too quickly, the Spanish began bringing slaves from Africa. Millions of Africans were forcibly removed from their native lands and sold into slavery in America. A tragedy began, the consequences of which are felt to this day. This was the greatest demographic collapse in history, a catastrophe of such scale that its consequences changed the entire world. Scholars calculated that due to the extinction of the indigenous population of the Americas and the subsequent regrowth of forests on abandoned fields, a huge amount of carbon dioxide stopped entering the atmosphere. This may even have influenced the global climate, contributing to the onset of the Little Ice Age in Europe in the 17th century. Christopher Columbus opened a new world for Europe. He expanded the horizons of humanity, connected continents, and initiated the era of globalization. His discovery is comparable in significance to the greatest achievements in human history, to the invention of writing, to the first human flight into space. But for the indigenous inhabitants of America, he opened the gates of hell. He brought diseases, slavery, and death. His appearance marked the beginning of the end for hundreds of peoples and cultures. Two sides of the same coin, a great geographical discovery and the greatest tragedy, the triumph of the human spirit, perseverance, and dream, and the monstrous price of this triumph. And the most terrible, the most tragic thing, Columbus never learned exactly what he had done. He did not learn the scale of his discovery. He did not learn that he had discovered not a route to India, but an entire new continent. Nor did he learn the scale of the tragedy he had unleashed. He died believing he was right, that he served God and the crown, that he had fulfilled his destiny. He died in ignorance, and the continent he discovered received the name of another man, the one who understood what the discoverer did not. History is cruel in its irony. Christopher Columbus died on the 20th of May, in the 1506th year in the Spanish city of Valladolid, sick, forgotten, disappointed. He was buried modestly, without honors. No one at the time could have predicted that centuries later his name would become one of the most celebrated and simultaneously most cursed in human history. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the heroization of Columbus began. Protestant America saw him as almost a saint, a man who, by God's will, opened the New World for European Christians. His name became incredibly popular. In the 1784th year, King's College in New York was renamed Columbia College. In the 1790th year, the nation's capital was moved to the District of Columbia. States such as South Carolina and Ohio established their governments in the cities of Columbia and Columbus. Irish and Italian immigrants, whom the Protestant elite of the United States despised, saw a path to legitimacy in Columbus. In the 1882nd year, a group of Irish Catholic priests founded the fraternity Knights of Columbus, which Italian Americans later joined. For them, Columbus became a symbol of the Catholic contribution to American history. Columbus Day became an official federal holiday in the 1971st year. On the 12th of October, parades, solemn events, and speeches about the greatness of the explorer took place across the country. Columbus was perceived as a hero who brought civilization to a savage world. But in the 20th century, re-evaluation began. The movement for the rights of indigenous peoples of America gained strength. Indigenous people, descendants of those who were killed, enslaved, and expelled from their native lands, asked the question, why should we celebrate the day our tragedy began? For them, the 12th of October, in the 1492nd year, is not a day of discovery, but the day the genocide began, the day their world began to die. From the mid-90s of the 20th century, individual states and cities began rejecting Columbus Day and replacing it with Indigenous Peoples Day. In the 1992nd year, Berkeley, California, was the first city to adopt this decision. Others followed. In the 2017 year, the Los Angeles City Council voted to replace the holiday. The decision passed with 14 votes in favor and 1 against. Representatives of the Italian community opposed it, citing their historical heritage. But for many residents, Columbus's name became a symbol of genocide. In the 2021 year, President Joe Biden, for the first time, announced the celebration of Indigenous Peoples Day at the federal level, parallel to Columbus Day. The presidential statement read, "We recognize that many European explorers brought injustice and atrocities to indigenous peoples. The measure of our greatness as a country is that we do not seek to hide these shameful episodes of our past. We honestly acknowledge them." By this time, 13 states were celebrating Indigenous Peoples Day instead of Columbus Day. In South Dakota, the holiday is called Native Americans Day. In New York schools, Columbus Day was removed from the calendar. But the real turning point occurred in the summer of the 2020th year. Following the death of African-American George Floyd at the hands of police in the United States, mass protests against racism erupted. And, along with monuments to Confederate generals, statues of Columbus began to be torn down. In Minneapolis, protesters pulled down and smashed the monument in front of the Minnesota State Capitol building. In Richmond, Virginia, the statue was doused with paint, set on fire, and thrown into a lake. In Boston, it was decapitated. In Baltimore, protesters used ropes to pull down the monument and tossed it into the bay waters. The administration of Tower Grove Park in St. Louis dismantled a Columbus monument that had stood there for 140 years. The statement read, "When the monument was erected 140 years ago, it was done to commemorate the contribution of immigrants to the region's development. However, for many now, it is a symbol of historical neglect of indigenous peoples as well as the eradication of their communities." In a few months of protests, 33 Columbus monuments were taken down, some by government decision, others spontaneously. The administrations of Bridgeport, Pittsburgh, San Francisco, Chicago, and Hartford decided to independently dismantle the statues. The Black Lives Matter movement stated, "Columbus's arrival in America served as the beginning of a century of colonization, genocide, slavery, and racial oppression." But the coin has another side. Many Italian Americans perceive the attacks on Columbus as attacks on their identity. New York State Governor Andrew Cuomo protested against replacing Columbus Day. Why is it necessary to diminish the contribution of Italian Americans to recognize the contribution of indigenous peoples? He deemed the decision destructive and stated that the day would remain a holiday at the state level. Columbus Day was made a holiday by Italian Americans, say defenders of the tradition. That is why they get upset every time people try to cancel it. The debates do not cease. Some say, without Columbus, there would be no modern civilization, no America, no progress. Thanks to European colonization, new technologies emerged, cultures mixed, and the world became one. Others reply, without Columbus, there would be no genocide of indigenous peoples, no transatlantic slave trade, no centuries of oppression. The price of this civilization is millions of lives. Who is right? Perhaps both. The story of Columbus is about how a great discovery can simultaneously be a great tragedy, how one man can be both a hero and a villain, how the dream of changing the world leads to the destruction of entire peoples. Christopher Columbus changed the history of humanity. That is undisputed. But at what cost? And do we have the right to celebrate this discovery, knowing what it cost? There is no answer. There are only questions that each new generation asks anew. Christopher Columbus understood the power of words. He was not merely a navigator, he was a storyteller, the creator of his own legend. From the first day of his voyage, he kept a diary addressed to the kings of Spain. He wrote in detail, meticulously, knowing that these records would be read not only by the monarchs, but also by posterity. In the prologue to the diary of the first voyage, Columbus framed his mission exactly as he wished to be perceived. Your Highnesses decided to send me, Christopher Columbus, to the said lands of the Indies, with the purpose that I might see those sovereigns and those peoples, and learn about the state of those lands, and also how it might be possible to convert them to our holy faith. He was a messenger of the faith. He was an instrument of God's will. Therefore, I resolved to describe this voyage in the most detailed way, day by day, recording everything I might do and everything that might happen to me. Columbus was creating not just a report, he was creating an epic, the chronicle of a great enterprise. An interesting detail: in his diary, Columbus wrote that he understated the distance covered to the crew so that the sailors would not be frightened. The men were told that 13 leagues had been covered, because they were constantly falsely told that they had covered less distance than the true distance, so that the journey might not seem long to them. But modern researchers believe that it was the opposite. Columbus exaggerated the distances in the diary to emphasize the scale of his achievement. Columbus's letters and diaries are written in heavy Castilian prose, resonating with a truly biblical pathos. When he speaks of gold, of the riches of the newly discovered lands, one senses the insatiable desire typical of the era of early accumulation. But at the same time, he constantly emphasizes the religious mission. In a letter to the monarchs after the third voyage, Columbus wrote, "I have told your Highnesses about the peoples I saw, and how many souls can find salvation." Even when he speaks of the indigenous people he sent to Spain for sale, he justifies it. The more pagans are transported to a Catholic country, the more souls will be saved. Columbus's psychological profile is a mixture of messianism, vanity, and sincere faith. He truly believed he was chosen by God, but at the same time, he craved glory, wealth, and titles. These two aspirations, spiritual and material, constantly fought within him and yet complemented each other. Columbus resembles the ancient Prometheus, the one who brought fire to people and was punished for it. He opened a new world, expanded the horizons of humanity, but paid for it with suffering, humiliation, and oblivion. But when comparing him to other conquistadors, Hernán Cortés, who conquered the Aztec Empire, or Ferdinand Magellan, who completed the first circumnavigation, Columbus appears different. Cortés was a cruel but effective conqueror. Magellan was a fearless navigator who died en route. Columbus, however, was a dreamer who never understood what exactly he had discovered. After Columbus's death, his image began to live its own life. The myth of the great explorer became an instrument of power. Spain used his name to legitimize colonial conquests. We are not invaders. We are continuing Columbus's work, bringing the light of civilization. The Catholic Church saw him as a missionary who opened millions of souls for conversion to the true faith. Immigrants in America, especially the Irish and Italians, made him a symbol of the Catholic contribution to American history. In the 19th century, when the United States was forming its national identity, Columbus became one of the founding fathers of the New World, although he himself never set foot on the territory of the future United States. Cities, universities, and holidays were named after him. But the myth was selective. Everything inconvenient was removed: the cruelty, the slavery, the failures as an administrator, the arrest in chains. Only the heroic remained: courage, faith in his dream, the great discovery. Columbus himself began creating this myth with his letters and diaries, and posterity perfected it. From a complex, contradictory man, a fanatic, a dreamer, an adventurer, a tyrant, they created a simple hero. Only in the 20th century did the myth begin to crumble. When the archives were opened, when historians began to study the documents without ideological filters, when the voices of the indigenous peoples were finally heard, it turned out that Columbus was not merely a hero. He was a man, with all his weaknesses, ambitions, fears, and cruelty. He created a legend about himself, but the reality proved far more complex than any legend. And here is the paradox. The very myth that Columbus began creating in his diaries 500 years ago still influences how we perceive him. Each generation rewrites his history anew. Some see a hero, some a villain, some see both simultaneously, but it all began with Columbus's own pen, with his diaries, letters, and justifications. He skillfully shaped an image that outlived him by centuries, a myth that created itself. After returning from the last expedition in the 1504th year, Christopher Columbus was a physically and spiritually broken man. He was just over 50, deep old age by 16th century standards. Tropical fevers, arthritis, insomnia, memory loss, and delirium tormented his body. Queen Isabella, who had once believed in his dream, died on the 26th of November, in the 1504th year. Her husband, King Ferdinand, treated Columbus with cold indifference. The Admiral wrote letters begging for the return of his titles, privileges, and the 10th share of trade from the new lands. But the king refused. Columbus felt betrayed. He had dedicated his entire life to serving the crown, opened an entire continent for Spain, and endured incredible hardships. And what did he get in return? Arrest in chains, humiliation, revoked titles, oblivion. His money ran out. Columbus spent everything that remained of his fortune on paying the debts of his comrades from the last expedition. He lived in a small house in Valladolid, almost in poverty. On the 20th of May, in the 1506th year, a Friday, Christopher Columbus felt that he was dying. His son Diego and several loyal friends were nearby. The last words he spoke were the same as those Jesus spoke on the cross. "Into your hands, O Lord, I commit my spirit." He died in the 55th year of his life. The man who changed the history of humanity died almost unnoticed. Contemporaries did not attach much significance to his death. No state funeral, no lavish ceremonies. He was buried modestly, quietly, in the Franciscan monastery in Valladolid. Only the city of Seville announced 3 days of mourning. Columbus never learned what he had discovered. Until his last day, he was convinced that he had found the western route to the islands near Asia. He did not learn that a year after his death, a German cartographer would name the new continent America, in honor of another man. But this was only the beginning of his body's posthumous fate. In the 1523rd year, Columbus's son, Diego, moved his father's remains to Seville and buried them in the Carthusian monastery. The remains lay there for 17 years. In the 1540th year, Emperor Charles V decided to fulfill Columbus's dying wish, to be buried in the New World. The remains were transported to the island of Hispaniola and interred in the Cathedral of Santo Domingo. In the 1795th year, when the Spanish part of the island was transferred to France, the ashes were moved again, this time to Cuba, to the Havana Cathedral, and in the 1898th year, after the Spanish were expelled from Cuba, the remains returned to Seville. Since then, Christopher Columbus's tomb has been in the Seville Cathedral. 4 countries, Spain, the Dominican Republic, Cuba, and even Jamaica, dispute where the great navigator's bones actually rest. In the 1877th year, during the restoration of the cathedral in Santo Domingo, a box with bones was found bearing an inscription stating, "They belonged to Columbus." In the 1992nd year, the Dominican remains were moved to a specially built lighthouse monument. Even after death, his body cannot find peace, as if the earth itself does not know what to do with this man. The enormous significance of Columbus's discoveries for Spain was recognized only in the middle of the 16th century. After the conquest of Mexico, Peru, and the empires in the north of the Andes, when ships laden with silver and gold began flowing into Europe, the very gold that Columbus sought all his life and never found. By the 17th century, his name became a legend. Heroization, a cult, monuments, and cities named in his honor. The man who died in oblivion was resurrected as a symbol. But what remained after him? 2 vast continents opened to Europe, a new era in human history, a revolution in geography, cartography, and world view. The beginning of globalization, when the world became one for the first time. And 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas perished within a century. Ruined empires, burned cities, peoples wiped from the face of the earth. The beginning of the transatlantic slave trade, when millions of Africans were brought to the New World to replace the extinct indigenous people. Centuries of colonialism, oppression, and inequality. Every great discovery is an act of destruction. It is impossible to open a new world without destroying the old one. When 2 worlds meet, one of them always loses. Columbus dreamed of changing history, and he changed it. But not as he imagined. He dreamed of finding gold, and they found it, but only after his death. He dreamed of converting millions of pagans to Christianity, and they converted them by force, blood, and terror. He dreamed of becoming the great ruler of new lands, and was exiled in chains. There can be no new world without destruction. But what destruction can be justified for creation? When the price of progress is millions of lives, is that progress worth the price? There are no unambiguous answers to these questions. History knows no subjunctive mood. We cannot go back and change what happened. Columbus was a man of his time, a fanatic of faith, a dreamer, an adventurer, a cruel tyrant, a brilliant navigator, all at once. He was neither a saint nor a demon. He was simply a man, with all his weaknesses, ambitions, and delusions. A man who walked through the darkness, not knowing where the path led. He believed he was bringing light, and brought darkness. He dreamed of glory and died in oblivion. He discovered a new world and did not understand what he had discovered. His story is the story of all humanity. We constantly move forward, not knowing where the path will lead. We destroy the old to create the new. We dream of changing the world for the better, and often only make things worse. Christopher Columbus died on the 20th of May, in the 1506th year. But the history he began continues to this day, and we are still trying to understand, who was he really? A hero or a villain? A savior or a destroyer? A prophet or a madman? Perhaps both. Perhaps it is in this contradiction that his essence lies. A man who walked his path in the darkness and illuminated the road for everyone else, however terrible that road may have been. Введите текст. Первый источник. Студия. Аудиопересказ. Видеопересказ. Ментальная карта. Отчеты карточки. Тест. В выходные данные из студии будут сохраняться здесь. Добавив источники, используйте кнопки для создания аудиопересказа, методички, ментальной карты и так далее. Ответы ноутбук LM могут быть неточны. Обязательно проверяйте их.